Have we been lied to about how Christianity began? According to one popular conspiracy theory, Jesus was just a teacher or prophet. The Apostle Paul reinvented him as the Son of God who rose from the dead. To support this idea, people sometimes claim that Paul didn't know much about Jesus.
It is true that the Apostle Paul, whose letters most likely represent the earliest known Christian literature, with the possible exception of the letter of James, do not refer in detail to the events of Jesus' life. They certainly talk a lot about Jesus, and they make frequent references to his crucifixion and resurrection, which Christians came very early to recognize was the heart of what they understood him to be about, a death that was not just a martyr's death, but one which atoned for the sins of the world, and that the claims he made during his life were vindicated by his bodily resurrection from the dead. Having said that, there are quite a few scattered quotations, or more commonly allusions, to the teachings of Jesus found in the letters of Paul, all the more significant because most of these letters were written in the 50s of the first century, and the most likely early dates for the Gospels, some would put them even later, would be in the 60s. So it's not as if Paul was pulling a scroll off of his shelves and looking at what Matthew, Mark, or Luke had written. It was the ongoing oral tradition that was faithfully passing on Jesus' teaching about a broad array of topics, such as divorce and remarriage in 1 Corinthians 7, such as Jesus' teaching on the Last Supper, what Christians call communion, or the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, in 1 Corinthians 11, teaching on Jesus' part about his return and the end of the world, found in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and elsewhere. A broad array of references. Paul was writing letters. He was not writing biographies of Jesus, so there was no reason to tell the story in great detail to groups of people who were already Christians and therefore had heard the stories. But there are a surprising number of references which give the lie to the idea that Paul was not interested in Jesus.
I think that's a very interesting point, that Paul doesn't say a lot in his letters about the ministry and life and teaching of Jesus. And one conclusion might be that he really didn't know much, or that he didn't care much about these things. However, I think that's quite a wrong reading. Paul's letters were quite specifically troubleshooting letters. They were written largely to people he knew and had worked with before, to established Christian churches, and Paul in his letters is dealing with the problems that had arisen in those churches, and he's trying to help the Christians as they wrestle with particular problems. So in his letters, he's not laying the basic foundations of Christian faith, he's dealing with problems that have come up later. But interestingly, when he deals with problems, from time to time, he does say, "When I was with you, I passed on these traditions of Jesus." He reminds them, for example, of how Jesus at the Last Supper broke the bread and gave the wine to his disciples. He reminds his readers in Corinth about how Jesus rose from the dead and was seen by various witnesses. And Paul says, "I passed on to you what I also received." In other words, he speaks of passing on Christian traditions. So I think when he founded churches, of course, he taught them lots about Jesus. And they would have wanted to know. Otherwise, why would they have believed? He passed on lots of the stories and sayings of Jesus. But in his letters, he's not doing that. He's doing the later troubleshooting. But we can see in his letters, again and again, he's echoing those stories of Jesus, occasionally referring back directly to Jesus' teaching. For example, on the subject of marriage and divorce, he refers back to that on one occasion. He refers back to it directly on some occasions, but very often in his letters we can almost hear him echoing the teaching of Jesus and stories about Jesus, and he expects his readers to know about it because he's taught them already.
Paul knew a lot about Jesus. He wrote his letters to solve problems in the churches he'd set up. In his letters, Paul refers in passing to what he taught them about Jesus, and he expects his readers to know what he's talking about. So have we been lied to about how Christianity began? The claim that Paul reinvented Jesus is misleading. Before Paul, the first Christians already believed that Jesus was the Son of God and had risen from the dead. Next time, we'll look at the claim that there were many different kinds of Christianity in the early years. The kind we have today triumphed by force.